Hey, Miss Clara Clark, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mickey. It's exciting to be here.
Yeah, I'm so happy to finally get to talk to you here and get to learn more about your experience in force biometrics.
Yeah, no, it'll be exciting to let everyone know a little bit more about me.
Yeah. So, just to get us started, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about what it is that you do in your current role?
Yeah, so I am a senior forest biometrician at American Forest Management. So I do a lot of growth and yield modeling for our different properties. AFM is kind of all over the whole country. We have properties in the south. We're very heavily in the southeast, and then we also have in the Lake States and the Northeast region, and then we're also in the Pacific Northwest and in Central America as well. I primarily focus on southeastern growth and yield modeling, kind of building yield tables to put into our Woodstock models that our planners do, and then also I do a lot with our northern, northeast, and lake state properties. I do a lot of just kind of inventory management with those, and then also doing and creating yield tables to put into Woodstock and just kind of, making changes as it goes. I do a lot with FVS and just kind of keeping those up to date and working with large data sets.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk to you today because of our shared experience. We're both consulting biometricians, and so we overlap a lot, and we even sometimes get to not really work together, but to get to pass data sets back and forth. But before we get into all that, I just would like to get to know your background, your history. How did you get into forestry and forest biometrics in specific?
Yeah. So I'm originally from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So I knew a lot about forestry kind of tangentially, not necessarily the nitty gritty details of it, but it was something that's a large part of the culture up there. But growing up, was really into math, and I really enjoyed like helping my teachers. And so I really thought I was going to be a math teacher. And so I the top education program in the country is at Michigan State, which for me was in-state tuition, so it was kind of a no-brainer to go there. So I decided to go to Michigan State for education, and I wanted to be a math teacher. And I worked at a scout camp for 2 summers. And while I was there, I kind of realized I didn't really have the patience to be a teacher. It was something that, while I liked, it wasn't necessarily what I really knew I was passionate about and wanted to do. The things that I really liked about camp were kind of being outside, working in the woods, and just kind of getting out and doing things with nature. Those were the things I really liked. So I kind of thought about it a lot and kind of figured out what I wanted to do. And about halfway through my undergrad, I realized I didn't want to be a teacher fully. I fully was set on that. So I was kind of looking through kind of majors and what I could do. And I knew just from my background in my childhood a little bit about forestry. We had some family friends that were loggers, and we had wood heat. So I was constantly talking to people in the forest world, just kind of on the opposite side of forestry. And so I decided, forestry sounds like a really cool major. I want to look into that more. And one of my friends at Michigan State, her mom worked for the Department of Natural Resources in the UP for the state of Michigan. And so I was able to, she set up a meeting with her mom, and I was able to shadow her for a day. And I really loved it. It was really cool. She showed me some of the work that they do inside the office, just typical office work. And then also we went out and I shadowed her, and it was amazing. I loved it. I remember thinking like all of the tools that we used were really cool. One of them that I was super excited about was a D tape. I just loved that it already had that factor of pi in it, and it was just an easy way to get a diameter quickly, which probably was a little bit of foreshadowing of where my career was going to lead me. But it was just something I thought was really cool. And that was when I knew, that was over spring break. And so I knew when I got back to state, my plan was to switch my major officially to forestry. So I did that at the end of my sophomore year. And then I was able to kind of squeeze in all the forestry classes that I needed because I had all my prereqs done. So I squeezed everything in the last 2 years of my program. And I kind of assumed that I would go to work for like the DNR or the Forest Service, because that's kind of what everyone that I was going to school with did. It was kind of hinted that getting into consulting would be very difficult, so that's not something I ever thought I would do when I was an undergrad. And then one of my professors gave a presentation on R in one of my classes, and everybody else was like super bored with it. And it was one of those where I was like, this is really cool. It's combining like all of the math stuff that I've learned with this cool forestry stuff that I really like. And so at the time I was taking 18 credits. And so I went up to my professor, it was Dr. Andy Finley. And I went up to him and was thinking about it. I was like, next semester, I only have 16 credits. I could probably do like up to a 2-credit independent study. And so I went up to him and was talking to him, and he had some extra funding. And so he was able to actually offer me a job in his lab. And so that's where I really kind of started getting into R, and kind of learning some things. I feel like I honestly did not learn. He taught me a lot, but I feel like my skill level at the end of that was not anywhere. It was not grand, but I did learn a lot through him. And he was really encouraging to kind of push me towards grad school. Like, I kind of figured, I'd go work for a couple of years and then maybe I'd come back for a graduate degree. So that was something like on my own. Graduate school was something I had kind of considered, but wasn't really sure about. And he was very encouraging about just, trying to see if grad school was something I would want to do, and kind of pushing me in that direction. And so we ended up, he was very encouraging, helped me like with applications. And so I was really, at that point in time, I was really focused on like polar opposites of forestry. I was looking at human dimensions and biometrics. Those were the 2 things that I was really interested in, which does make sense from like being a math education major, going from like biometrics, the very math heavy part, and human dimensions, the very people heavy part that teaching is. So while they're completely opposite ends, it did make sense with where I was with my, my education. And so I ended up going to Virginia Tech. Dr. Phil Radke accepted me into as one of his students. And so I went to Virginia Tech right after I was done with Michigan State, and did my research project was the giant biomass project that I feel like a lot of people in the 2010s was working on. I focused specifically on white oak. And so we did a lot of destructive sampling, out in the woods, cutting trees, weighing all the sections, drying all of the leaves and branches and picking all the leaves off, just to get all of the information and doing all of that. And so that's what I did for my graduate degree. And I thoroughly enjoyed that and finished up at Virginia Tech, which was just a fantastic place to be. As a fellow Hokie, you also know how magical Blacksburg is. And so, so finished up there. And then I got hired at AFM as a forest planning analyst. And so with that, I did a lot of just harvest schedules. I started really heavily in the Southeast, doing a lot of just a lot of Southeastern harvest schedules and dealing with a lot of loblolly pine. And then kind of as I got more familiar with that, I was able to kind of jump into some of our northern properties with my background in the north, which was really exciting. And I loved kind of getting back to what I initially went to school for. And then after that, after a couple of years of doing that, AFM got to the point where they were ready to add on a 3rd biometrician full-time. And I was able to kind of pretty seamlessly jump over to that position, which was fantastic. And that's what I've been doing for the last 8 years now. So that's kind of overall what I did and how I got here.
Wow, that's well, first of all, thank you for sharing your background. It's obviously, a lot of changes that got you to where you were, wanting to start in math, and then, going to forestry, and then getting back into forestry math, which is what we do.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to say that I love, you talked about that human dimension side, but one of the things I love about our field is the collaborative spirit. And I think you, Clara, personally embody that spirit, because whenever I see you, you're so open and willing to share and willing to talk about problems you're working on. And I think that's great.
Yeah, I think some of that too is just being in consulting. It's kind of more natural as a consultant when you're out at meetings to want to talk about things. One of the things that our CEO talks about a lot is how, like, as consultants, the people, we're the asset, like we're the business. It's not, we don't own land, so it's not, how many trees do we have? What are the mills producing or anything like that? For us, it's very much what we're doing. And so, kind of being out, and when I go to meetings, getting to talk to people about the things we're doing. I want people to know what we're doing. It's not a big industry secret or anything like that. Like, we want people to know what we're doing so that they, in theory, can hire us, or they can help us, just learn more. And I'm all about like learning and expanding the field. And I feel like being able to talk to people and get out and have those conversations is also a great way to do that. I think, Yeah, I like working with people. I like getting to, see people from different perspectives, and all of that. Like, I think it's just a great way to advance our field every time we can.
Yeah, and I love consulting. I think it's a great place to be, especially for people that like interacting with other people. Because while all of our clients might have, a similar problem, there might be 90 to 95% similarities. It's that 5 or 10% differences that makes each client unique. And those specific nuances make, working with the individual client so much fun.
Hmm. Yeah, I have clients that are very different. We've got some that are, very specific, that have more of like, they have a lot of forestry background. They're the people that work with them. They went to forestry school. They've, done a bunch of field work, and now they're kind of more on like the TMO administration side. But then we also have clients that their background is strictly financial, and all of the forestry things that they've learned from working through that company. And so just kind of how you have to explain that to different people, or how those two different sets of clients, is sometimes very different on how you explain it. And so, yeah, there's some properties that we have that, client A owned, and then they sold it to client B. And even the differences in how those two different clients might handle that land base that we, had managed before for client A, and now we're managing for client B, and there's slight differences with that. Um, those are all things that I think are really interesting to work with, and just being able to communicate differently to different clients and what they are interested in. For a client that has a strong forestry background, one of the things that I've worked through is inventories. For us as biometricians, like, as long as you're within the statistics, like, yeah, this is great. But if they're like, this is almost 1,000,000 acres, like, this is a large land base, like, those little differences are making millions of dollars of differences. And so, just they're like, how can we tighten this up? And when, you're looking at it from a biometric standpoint, like, well, you're within the statistics, like, this is exactly what we expected it to be. And just kind of, trying to tighten those things up and make it so they're more comfortable with it. And even just explaining to them like the differences and why we're okay with that acceptable range, and what that means and the implications it can mean, especially because, when you start to get to higher value products, small differences can start to make a huge financial difference, and when you're dealing with more institutional investment knowledge, those little differences for us aren't a big deal because it's within what we would expect it to be. It's very accepted in our industry. But when you're starting to look at it with the dollar signs, sometimes it can be a little bit more of a challenge. And so, yeah, just making sure that, we're ensuring our clients are comfortable with things, and just kind of working through all those processes is always interesting, and I enjoy it.
Exactly. Always improving, always moving one step forward. Sometimes you take a step back and then you try to get two steps forward.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as a consulting forester or biometrician, I also experienced the same thing. As you said, we don't own land. We manage land for private forest landowners and TMOs, and we generally have to be able to get the word out on what we're doing. And I love that, like you, our executive team is very, very interested in promoting the science and investing in the science and getting us out there and making us, go to conferences so we can learn more about what's going on. So it's a great field, consulting.
Yeah, it is. I very much enjoy it.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is that, while all of our landowners have kind of different objectives, which are, kind of similar in the same realm, they're diverse enough that usually most problems are not the same. So you always have to wear your thinking cap on, okay, how do I approach this specific, inventory update or harvest schedule, because the landowner's objectives are slightly different than everybody else's.
Yeah, it is sometimes incredible how two clients, have, even I think some of they have similar land. Sometimes even, client A has the land and sells it to client B, and now it's managed slightly differently.
Right.
Like, I've worked on this property, like this hypothetical property, for both client A and client B, and just the differences in being able to, like, what they want to do, what they want to see, or even sometimes just how to explain it to them. some of our clients have really strong forestry backgrounds. Some of them went to forestry school. Some of them worked for forestry companies before moving over to like a TMO or an investment of some sort organization. And then other of our clients are very much from the investment side. And so they don't have that experience of forestry as much. And so, you know, for the more forestry, like the ones with more forestry experience, they understand like, okay, it's within the statistics of what we designed our inventory for example. Like, yeah, we're good with that. And others that have maybe more of just that institutional investment knowledge are more kind of like, well, okay, I know it's within 5%, but that's still like, this is a giant property. That's still millions of dollars. Like we need to tighten this up a little bit. And so just having those conversations and knowing between different clients, like what type of conversation I'm going to have with them is always interesting too. Cause it's so different. And that is one thing that I do like about consulting is it is very different on a day-to-day basis between whether like which client I'm working with or which project I'm working on. And sometimes even projects within like the same client can be very different. So it just kind of, it's, I don't know, it's intriguing and I like it. And it keeps, I don't know, I feel like it keeps me fresh.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious just because of our shared experience here, but you know, you work in a much broader region than I do. So I pretty much focus on the Southeast, where we have our growth and yield models coming from the co-ops, or we have FBS coming from the US Forest Service. That's not a lot of models to work with for me compared to you, who's working all over the place. So I'm curious, just from your experience, you know, how do you think about growth and yield, you know, as a whole across all of the areas that you work in? Do you see some disconnect with how the models are being developed and how they're applied? Or do you feel kind of a synergy that people are mostly working towards a similar direction?
I feel like most people are working kind of towards that similar direction. I mean, in the Southeast, we have primarily loblolly pine, which has been studied extensively by lots of people, especially in the co-ops. We are members of both the PMRC and the FMRC and like the FPC. For like silviculture, most of the co-ops were somehow related to. And so like all of those, obviously, you know, working with the same species have very similar aspects. But then if you move up to like the Northeast and the Lake States, we use FES mostly for our growth on that. It's, you know, there's a lot of conversations about FES and how good it is or how much it struggles in places. We know in the Southeast, FES doesn't do a great job, especially when you're looking at more industrial forests. If you're looking at a national forest, FES does pretty decent because that's a lot more of the data that it's built off of, which makes sense. But in the Lake States region in the Northeast, FES does pretty decent as well. There's some levers that we need to pull to be able to kind of make the growth more accurate for our models. But it's kind of one of those where it works. Like we know what levers we need to pull. We have data that we can do that. And you know, a lot of the big things are just like, how fast are we growing, which is a question constantly in the Southeast and the Pacific Northwest also, just like how fast are we growing and how are we merchandising? And I feel like those are very similar on any region that we're working in. You know, there's differences in the equations that we're using for merchandising because, for example, hardwoods tend to be merchandised differently than softwoods. And in the Southeast, we don't typically, most of our clients, we're not merchandising our hardwood nearly as intensive as we're merchandising our pine, just because pine is the big species in the Southeast. But in the Northeast and the Lake States, like hardwood is more of an important species, especially in the Lake States. And so it's kind of one of those where, you know, we're using different equations, but they all kind of relate to the same things. I mean, it's still trees, like they're, and so, you know, as long as you have growth models that seem to be working pretty decent and merchandising equations that are tried and tested and tend to work well, like there are a lot of synergies between like the Southeast and the Northeast or in the North in general. So like it doesn't take me, like I feel like if they were super different, it would take me a long time to go from one headspace to the other. And I can jump back and forth between the North and the South pretty quick in a day if need be.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you mentioned, which is, I think, kind of understudied, is the merchandising. I mean,
Mhm.
we have plenty of good models to produce, weight or volume, and they generally tend to be unbiased.
Mhm.
But then merchandising after the fact is like it's not studied as well. So, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but we just generally have to come up with our own models, our own assumptions, and come up with a product distribution after the fact. And it's one of my complaints about FES. It spits out a saw timber and a pulpwood, volume, but it doesn't account for any downgrades or anything like that. Which I guess if you have the diameter distribution and you have the product distribution to begin with, you can put that in. But if you're growing from, as we do with loblolly pine, as we grow from bare earth, well, then we don't have that merchandising at the end, which we have to
Mhm.
come up with something. So,
Yeah, when it comes to FES, we pretty much never merchandise with FES.
yeah,
Um,
that's
yeah,
either.
especially just because it's only the two products. And in the Southeast, we usually have at least three products. In the North, we usually have at least four products. And in the Pacific Northwest, we use a completely different growth system. We use
Mhm.
FPS usually.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, so it's one of those where there are a lot of differences, or not FES, it gets you what you need if you don't need a lot. But when you're dealing with more industrial things and you need kind of, those big value changes, like how much veneer you have is going to drastically change the cost of your harvest.
yeah,
And it's going to change your revenues drastically. So if all you're producing is pulpwood and saw timber, like that's not helpful. So yeah, so we do all of our merchandising outside of FES. Even the occasional times that we've done some FES testing in the Southeast, we also will merchandise it outside of FES, mostly because we want chip and saw.
yeah.
And it's a key part in some of our markets. Chip and saw is one of our stronger products. In some markets, chip and saw doesn't really have much of a market, but it just kind of depends, and we want to have that flexibility. And you can't get that with only two products.
Right. And we're seeing in some markets where chip and saw doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's saw timber to a different top diameter, and then you get paid differently on that.
Yeah.
So it's merchandising is becoming increasingly more important as we get a varied range of products. It was easy whenever there were only two and there were very hard breaks on diameter. it's
Yeah.
much more complicated now. And I don't know, maybe we could borrow from, the Australians and the New Zealanders who have, 20 or 30 different product sorts and softwood. I don't know.
I'm okay only having three or four that we're modeling.
Yeah.
Makes it a little bit easier. And a lot of times, like a lot of those products, because we do have clients occasionally that'll kind of press us for more products. Mostly in the Southeast and the northern part, we're pretty solid on what we have. But
Yeah.
they'll be like, "Oh, well, we do have a fourth or a fifth saw timber product," and you start questioning them about it, and it's really the difference is, well, they're the same diameter, but this one's it's a clearer grade. And like,
Yeah.
all right, well, we don't really have a way to do that. Do you know? And so we'll do like blended prices in our modeling to kind of help benefit that of like, okay, well, we've got, we know you have these two products that are the same diameter distribution, um, or same diameter constraints of like it has to be this big or this small. And so do you know like roughly what percentage of your product goes to product 4 versus product 5? And then, just kind of do like a blended price. And a lot of times that captures what we need, especially if we're
Yeah.
doing a strategic model. Sometimes we do more tactical models, but a lot of times it's strategic planning. And so it's, the results from a model are not necessarily, this is exactly what you have to do on the ground.
Right.
We're just like, this is our this is a blueprint. This is a good idea to follow. But also, if it makes more sense to harvest it 2 or 3 years earlier or later because of your harvest or your operation constraints,
Mhm.
you've got to build a road, so you're not going to build a road for a 5-acre parcel. But in 3 years, we're planning on doing this 100-acre parcel right next to it. Like harvest it at the same time. That makes sense. So yeah,
Right.
there's a lot of that back and forth too.
Yeah, I generally enjoy that part of harvest scheduling with our forest managers is that back and forth, trying
Mhm.
to figure out their operational constraints on top of the landowners like financial constraints, and then trying to make all of those things work. I think it's really an art, harvest scheduling.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And there's a lot of, I don't know, I think that's one of the things that I enjoy. as a biometrician, I don't get to do it as much, but I did enjoy when I was an analyst being able to like have those conversations with foresters, especially the forester that was very skeptical. Like, I don't know that I believe this. Like, what do you know? Like, well, I don't know what's on the ground. So like, let's figure out a plan that makes this work. And, you know, that's something that I do really enjoy, is just being able to like work with people and kind of figure out like what is the best plan. And I'm very aware the answers that I give you are not necessarily what matches on the ground perfectly.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, if it was always perfect, I wouldn't have a job anymore. And so it's one of those where, you know, it's a little bit of like that give and take, and just kind of working together and being part of a team, and just making sure that we're, you know, doing the best that we can to benefit our landowners specifically.
Yeah. I always enjoy that first conversation with the managers. It's like, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. This is just maybe helpful for you. But, you know, the landowner is going to use this in their financial projections. So maybe try to use it.
Yeah.
And it's those, you know, certain little operational constraints that you were talking about, just matching the stands, that sometimes it doesn't happen. And I feel like that generally creates the most skepticism, because they're going, I'm not going to harvest that 5-acre stand. Why did you suggest that? And it's like, well, according to the financial model, it just makes sense to harvest it now. But you got to tell me you can't get to it, because I don't know that.
Yeah, yeah. Especially if you're dealing with a non-spatial harvest schedule. Like we're just trying to maximize whatever our objective statement is.
Right.
A lot of times that's NPV. Not always, but a lot of times for us it is. And so it's just, you know, well, for whatever reason, based on all of the constraints we have, this might have been 1 penny more beneficial to harvest this year versus next year. So like, we can move it. It's good.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's another thing that I try to point out, is that the difference in the change in NPV is not even close to the amount of variation in the data and in the model. So
Yeah.
move it a year or two if you need to make the plan work.
Yep.
And I enjoy trying to, you know, try to pull in some of those operational constraints that are sometimes strange. You mentioned earlier about the spatial model. But sometimes you don't necessarily need a full spatial constraint. You just need to be able to apply the constraint to certain different pieces of the property, for example, for access, because it's too wet, or, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
And those small things make the harvest schedules different and interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also a huge difference kind of between if you have like a strata level inventory versus a stand level inventory.
Right.
And most of our inventory at this point is stand level, and most of our modeling is stand level as well, which I know some people, there's pros and cons to doing both. Strata level tends to be, you have less inputs, you have less yield tables, so it goes a little faster. But then also you're just told like, I need to harvest 2,000 acres of this strata. Like, go find it, foresters.
Right.
Which can be a challenge for them. So if you do more of a stand level model, like you do have more yield tables, it is going to take a little bit longer to run, but then you can kind of give more of those like determined and specific areas that they should target. One thing that we've noticed is we have a lot of foresters who've worked a land base their entire career.
Yeah.
Maybe they've had, you know, 5, 6, 10 different landowners that they've worked for essentially, but they've worked that land base their whole career. And when they start to retire, you lose a lot of that institutional knowledge. And one of the big projects that I've worked on, and I've given a bunch of different presentations on in different capacities, was we did. That was part of the reason why we chose the inventory kind of change that we did, was because we had all of these foresters that were retiring, as they should. They've worked a wonderful long career. And so, you know, that institutional knowledge of, they knew like, all right, well, I need, you know, 20,000, not 20, I need 1,000 acres. I have 1,000 acres of this that I need to harvest in the next year. I know I can go to this stand and that stand and this other, like they just know it in their brain, and you can't really pass that on to somebody else. And so you have to, and that was specifically a strata level inventory. And that was something that we realized we needed to kind of move more to a stand level inventory, because our new foresters didn't have that knowledge, and there's no real way to transfer. Like I just know these stands, which makes sense. Like it's hard sometimes, even, you know, as a biometrician, some of the code and stuff that I do, it's hard to just pass it off to somebody else without like a lot, even though it's like documented in the code. Like I just know like these things, like I know these species, I know kind of how to do things. And so being able to transfer that like institutional knowledge has also been important in how we like manage our inventories. And why for that one specifically, we went from a strata level inventory to a LiDAR based inventory, just so that we could use more information for our foresters.
Yeah, that's interesting. We'll come back to the LiDAR inventory in a bit, but I want to say it's interesting working with those older guys who you said have that experience with the forest, and getting their feedback on like the inventory updates. And they're like, oh, Mickey, how did this grow so much? I know this part of this stand is going to have, less density because it got attacked by beetles, and that part over across the lake looks like this. And you're like, guys, I have plots to work with. Like, I don't know all of the things that you're talking about. So if we need to, you're designing the cruise. If we need to go back and relook at some of the stuff, then we can. But it's not the problem of the model. It's the input that's going into it.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, like, I know there's been a lot of talk in, especially like just the biometric circles and inventory circles and at meetings and conferences that we go to, like, there are less people going into forestry, especially the boots on the ground forestry. It is an industry where people are not necessarily as excited about it. You have to get like the right type of person that's very excited to go out into the woods and measure trees and walk through terrible forests and beautiful forests and in the hot or the cold, depending on where they are, and just dealing with all of these environmental variables. And so it's one of those where, like, how can we embrace technology to be able to, move forward with these things? Because clearly we need something so that we can make plots cheaper and like make it less, of a terrible experience for our foresters. But it's still one of those, like, all of those little things. Like, I know this part got attacked by a pine beetle, and I know this part, there was a fire or a hurricane that came through and affected this, or there was some like timber theft that, none of the plots fell into, that like this is an issue. Or, just, I know this section doesn't look like the rest of it. That boots on the ground information is so crucial. And something that I personally think we're never going to get rid of in forestry. I know some people kind of lean more towards they think we will, but I feel like there will always be that boots on the ground qualitative part of forestry that we just can't get away from. Like, I do lots of quantitative stuff, but I still regularly am on the phone talking to my foresters, asking them, like, tell me what you're seeing, tell me what this means, like, working on acquisitions or dispositions or doing due diligence projects. Like, there's a lot of back and forth. Like, the biometric, like our biometricians at AFM, we do one set of things, and then we're talking to our field foresters, like, do these numbers match? Like, does it pass your gut check? And that's something that, like, for us too, I'm very grateful that we have such a large footprint and such a great group of foresters that can just go and do that and have that very regional specific information that it's just impossible for me to have all by myself. So it's one of those, like, I very much rely on the other people that I work with too.
Yeah, it's very much a team effort, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the inventory from LiDAR, and like you, I agree, we're never going to get away from boots on the ground. I think one of the things that's just missing is the quality, which definitely is a huge part of the value. And it's difficult to call quality from a light return. So I was really excited early on whenever Tree Swift was doing the drone. Getting obviously the LiDAR and the photos, because then maybe you could come up with an algorithm to look through the photos and get quality that way. But there's just some forest types that I don't think that's ever going to work. If you're in East Texas and there's a heavy presence of yopon, you're not going to get down there. You're not going to see the trees. You're not going to see that first part of the stem and be able to call quality. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So I don't know that we're ever going to get to the point that we're fully boots off the ground.
Yeah, I agree. I know. So for our northern properties, veneer is the big one. That's, our big value driver. And I feel like that's another one that's going to be really hard, because sometimes veneer, like the quality, like most usually veneer is pretty set and like this is what it is. But sometimes the markets change a little bit, and you can have slightly less clear faces, or one mill will take only all clear faces. Another one is like, we can take a little bit less, and it's still classified as veneer. And so it's just like, it's hard to do that. And they change sometimes over time. The big thing that we've done with that is just kind of like taking that boots on the ground information and kind of figuring out like roughly this is what we think veneer is, and applying that to kind of like the whole property with, using more nuances than just like, all right, we think there's X amount of veneer on the whole property. Like obviously cedar's not going to ever have veneer. So it's not just a blanket. So, there's more nuances to it, but yeah, it's one of those, like, that's something that even if we, do LiDAR inventory from now until the end of time, like our foresters are the ones that are going out and doing those calls and giving us that information so that we can then apply it to what we need. Because yeah, it's just some of those calls, or some of those forest types are just, they're too difficult to do. And yeah, we need those boots on the ground. And I don't know, maybe I'm skeptical. I've been hearing pretty much my whole career, we're almost there. And so it's one of those, and we were almost there at the beginning of my career too. And it's been a while. So it's kind of one of those where, I'm a little skeptical, but we have made big leaps and bounds in the types of things that we're able to do with remote sensing. But yeah, I think there's always going to be that synergy between boots on the ground and remote sensing, and just kind of all of that together. And also just making sure that we are answering the questions that we need. And even just, I don't know, even the best remote sensing, like it's good to just get out there, because your loggers are going to see something. That's never not good. I mean, your loggers are going to have to go out and do things. And so being able to have that, like, ability to communicate what you're seeing with the loggers also kind of includes that boots on the ground aspect.
Yeah. I like the approach that this company, they're called Arboreal, they're out of Sweden, that they're taking with remote. I guess it's kind of could be considered remote inventory, but they've actually put an application on a phone or a tablet, and they're using the built-in LiDAR there. And they have a whole timber cruising side of the app that you're able just to go out there and put in plots. If you haven't seen it, look them up on the web. It's really exciting what they're doing, but it's with you. So you're there, you're the forester, you're making the calls on products, but it's still assisting you to help make those like kind of easy measurements, diameter and height, help them make those faster. And I think it even does like upper stem diameters and all of that. So all through an application. We tested it, and with an experienced cruiser, and it was just as fast or faster than putting in plots, normally. And the data were like so close, it was unbelievable. It's like this could just be measurement error difference. So
awesome.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I haven't seen it used that much here in the Southeast. I think a lot of people were, again, really excited about Tree Swift, and now about Gaia and their backpack and all of that. And again, I think that's great, but then you don't really need somebody who is experienced to walk around with the backpack. And so then you're going to lose that quality call because you don't have somebody experienced there doing it. So yeah. What do you think about the census of aerial LiDAR?
So I think aerial LiDAR can work. I feel like the big thing with that is it needs like another component to it. There are some companies that are getting a lot better at doing species mapping with aerial LiDAR. And that's always kind of been the big thing. When we flew our LiDAR for our clients in 2016 and 2017, we had another vendor that helped us with the tree list specifically, because we were putting in an FES, so you need tree lists. And that's how we got species from that. And while some companies, I think, are starting to get to the point where they are getting better at doing species identification from just aerial LiDAR, there is usually there's calibration plots which help you with that. So yeah, no, I think LiDAR is definitely beneficial, and it can definitely do things like help a lot. I know for us on our inventories that we did, one of the things that really helped was getting a DEM, specifically in Maine. It's very, the terrain does a lot of things in Maine, and so just being able to see, like, one of the things that they talked about, foresters talked a lot about with that was being able to have that DEM, and there were like pockets of wood that they knew were there, but didn't know how to get to them. And once they saw that DEM, they're like, oh, we can really easily build a road. Whereas before, like, they didn't have that clear idea. And so the ways that they had been getting to it was just really difficult. Or they just, knew the wood was there, but also knew they couldn't get to it. And so, being able to have that has definitely been beneficial. And so there are things like that that make it helpful. Using a canopy height model to be able to see, like, all right, how soon are these trees, especially when you have a large land base, and just a lot of trees, and especially when it's very remote, as most forestry is, just kind of figuring out, like, all right, does it make sense to send a forester, through this swamp to get to these trees to see if they're ready to harvest? You now have that canopy height model, and you're able to use that. And yeah, as long as you have a way to get species, whether that's, from the LiDAR, or if it's from some other sort of secondary source that helps you get it, I think you're able to get a lot of really great information. And for us also, with that project, we were able to go from a strata level inventory to a stand level inventory, which has been huge, because as time keeps going on, especially in the US, we keep moving more and more towards what people are calling precision forestry. And so, like, we want to be more precise. We want to go to the places that make the most sense. And so that's kind of some of the things that we've been able to do with LiDAR. So yeah, I am not at all a LiDAR expert. I do not use the point clouds at all. I don't do any of that analysis. We've always had vendors do that for us. I just take the large amount of tree data information and then move that forward with growth routines and merchandising, which is it's a completely different bear, but definitely useful, because that is the other tough thing with LiDAR inventory. When you do a strata level inventory on 1 million acres, you have like 2, maybe 3,000 plots. When you do a LiDAR inventory on 1 million acres, you have as many plots as pixels.
Right.
So you go from having, 2, maybe 3,000 plots to now having 10 million plots. And that's a lot of data to just process. And that was the big project that I worked on, and that I've like mentioned that I've done a bunch of different presentations on. Like, that was the big thing that was the challenge for me, is how do I take these 10 million plots and work it up in a way that makes sense? Because it doesn't make sense to grow each 10th acre plot by itself, because that's not operational. We're never going to send anyone anywhere for a 10th acre. We usually don't send anyone anywhere for like less than 10 acres. And so, putting those into tree lists, and then with FES, you've got the limitation of the number of tree records that you can put in. And so, bringing it down so that we can grow that stand forward in FES without losing the granularity of these trees. But also, do I really need a tree that's worth 0.001 trees per acre? Like, how can I kind of clump that together to get differences? So yeah, and just, managing that and putting it through FES, and how can I run 20,000 stands through FES in one time with all of my different harvest regimes and harvest windows, which means I'm running FES a whole bunch of times. And so just kind of figuring out all those different processes was kind of like the big thing. And for a while, people thought I knew a lot about LiDAR because I was working with a LiDAR inventory, but I really just knew how to manage a large inventory. Was really Yeah.
And that does make things a lot more complicated, because I couldn't even imagine trying to run 1 million acres with like 10th acre pixels through FES.
Yeah.
And then just growing it, for 20 years or whatever, but then adding on like management regimes and all of that on top of it. You could probably sit there for days waiting on that thing to run. and then find out you've got an error, and then you got to redo it.
Yeah. My big trick, if anybody's ever working with large data sets like that through FES, run test data sets, check all of your errors before you do that. And yeah, for that, we have 15-year harvest window. So I'm essentially running FES 16 times because you can't just in our Southern Pine models, you're just like, oh, my harvest window is I'm going to first thin from 11 to 16, and then I'm going to second thin from 20 to 24, and you just plug it in and the models it's set up so it all runs pretty easy. But FES, you can't do that. You have to change the cycle length, because you can also only put 40 years into 40 cycles into FES. So if you want to run at least a 50-year model, you have to do cycle things and change the cycle lengths. And so yeah, it's a giant project, and I took a lot to wrap my head around it. Kind of in the process, I became really efficient and good at FES, and have tried a bunch of really weird things. And that was also kind of with that project, our foresters were like, you can't do this. You can't model this in FES. And I was like, bet, I'm going to try. And so we've been able to do some really complicated harvest regimes that are very set on because FES, you have all this information. If you know how to code it up, it's a very powerful tool with its issues, as every model has. But it's a very powerful tool that you can do a lot with. And so being able to take, if this stand has this condition, especially in Michigan, we've got a lot of ash and emerald ash borer, and they're all dying. I'd be very surprised. They're all getting attacked by EAB. And so it's kind of one of those where all right, well, if we're going to release, we're going to salvage all of the ash we can, because we want to get it before it's dead. And if we come back in, minimum of 10 years, it's most likely going to be dead. So, salvaging all that ash, but then, okay, well, if we get all of that ash and we release, and it's a very ash heavy stand, we don't want to leave a super shocked stand there. We want to be able to, just release it and let it restart, because it was an ash stand, and we want to make it not that, so it could keep growing. And so just being able to put that into FES, it was one of those things that a lot of people told me you can't do it, but you can. It takes some very well thought out if statements. It's all very linear. So yeah, just kind of figuring all those things out and being able to run those yield tables through was really exciting for me when I finally got it to work, because there was a little bit where I was like, okay, I told them I'm going to try, and I'm not sure I'm going to get there. And then I got it, and it was really exciting. And one of those things that I was told by a lot of people, you can't do that in FES, and you can. Is it maybe perfect? Probably not, but it's doing a better job than just kind of throwing out a random thing that's not reflective of the ground.
Right.
And talking about all of the work that I do with foresters, that's something that's important to me, is being able to take their expertise, especially their expertise with boots on the ground, being able to apply that, because models are very powerful, and you have to stay within the confines of the model and what they were fit for. Right. But there's a lot that you can do within that, and just being able to take, I feel like that's where a forest biometrician really specializes, is we have that forestry background, we have that understanding, but then we also have the modeling and the statistic background. And so being able to take, this very complicated process that is very realistic, very, very much seen on the ground, and make it kind of translate that into a model is something that I just find, I don't know, very rewarding myself. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like that's the bread and butter of being a biometrician in my world. It's just taking, that's my job, is to translate what foresters want and put it into a model so that they can get the best outputs. And it also with those models that I've done that with, it's built a lot of rapport and trust in modeling with our foresters. People who were very skeptical of it at first are now, much, much more willing to be like, okay, maybe the model can do this. And they've gone and done some testing and been like, oh yeah, no, I see that this does work. This is doing what we want it to do. And so, I feel like foresters tend to be a little bit more skeptical. They're very skeptical of math. I'm sure you get called a biometrician regularly.
Yes.
And so it just seems magical, but there's a lot of when you really get into the nuances and looking at the models, it makes a lot of sense for my brain, because I am a very math-minded person. And so yeah, that's, I don't know, being a math education major before I switched to forestry, biometrics is perfect for me. It's that perfect marriage of math and trees, which are two things that I love, and just being able to communicate that to our foresters and to our clients as well. It's just like, this is things we can do. I don't know. I find it very exciting.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've had trouble with is not being so technical. I get told like, hey, Mickey, don't write this from your PhD perspective, put it in common tongue. And I'm going, well, I don't know that language.
Yeah, my husband works for the Catholic Church, and so I regularly am like, okay, let me explain this to you and see if it makes sense. And so he's like my test sometimes of like, can I explain this like not super technical? And again, like it depends on who I'm talking to. If I'm presenting at like a SOMANS meeting, it's going to be very different than if I'm the time that I presented at the Texas SAF meeting.
Right.
They're very different types of audiences, but yeah, just being able to like talk through it and just, I've got those people in my life that I can be like, okay, I'm not going to tell you anything like secret that I can't tell you, but also, does this generally make sense? And then like, if he can repeat it back to me, like, okay, I've got it, I've explained it. And if he's like, I have no idea what's going on, like, okay, let's try again. Because yeah, that being able to communicate that technical part is so crucial. Because it's so easy to get lost in the numbers, and even sometimes at presentations that I go to, I get lost, and I'm a biometrician, and I'm just like, I don't know what's going on anymore in this model. And so yeah, it's something that science literacy is huge, and being able to communicate that to people that haven't gone to grad school for forest biometrics is huge. And I don't know, it's exciting when you can actually explain it to people too. So
yeah. And then, the other thing is working with, you mentioned the landowners that have owned land for a long time. They're very knowledgeable about their forests. And then trying to, put a convincing argument forward as to why using, like, for example, a remotely sensed inventory is better than doing a strata level inventory or whatever it is that they've been used to.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing is like changing regimes. It's like, I know you used to do 3 thinnings, but you're in a chip and saw market now and you don't need to.
Yeah. Those are some of the like longer, like they're good conversations, but there's sometimes some of the more like difficult conversations to have of just like, all right, let me run some scenarios for you, especially with how the pine markets are changing in the South right now. And let's run some different scenarios. Let's see different things. Let's take the stumpage pricing that we know we're getting, because it's from it's an average of the last 10 years, or not last 10, like last year, last 4 quarters of the prices that you've gotten. Let's run some scenarios and see what it means. And yeah, we're a slow to change industry because our resource, our crop takes a really long time to grow. It's not like, well, it'll be done in 1 growing season. A short rotation in the US is, an 18 to 20 year pulpwood rotation in pine. And so, sometimes it's hard to be like, well, do I want to change it? Like, if I'm planting this, like, am I still only going to be in this type of market in 20 years? Or 40, 100 years? And so it's hard sometimes, like, having those conversations and just having that trust of being able, and so there is a lot of trust in consulting of just like, all right, this is what I want. Also, there's plenty of times where you're like, this is the best idea, this is what all of the data and all of the models are saying we should do, and the client's just like, no,
no thanks.
And then you're like, all right, well, we're going to keep moving forward as it is.
Yeah. One of the things that was interesting, my time in Norway, rotations were, up to 120 plus years. And working with some of their research data, their experimental plots, they would put them in. I mean, some of those were installed in the 1920s, and they had this idea about what they wanted to study. And then you come back 25 years later and all of those people are gone. There's a new cohort of people. And now all of a sudden there's new questions that they want to answer. So they go back into those, experiments and then modify it. And then all of a sudden it's not the same thing anymore. And then 25 years later, all of those people are gone and you got new people coming in and they want to change it again. So you're going, what am I actually analyzing here? It's like, 5 decades of people changing things.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, like, seeing, because it's such a long time frame in some parts of the world of just, you can't you can't make a difference. And when I talk to people who aren't in forestry, one of the things that I always stress is like, in forestry school, we were not taught we're managing forests for today. We're managing forests for our grandkids, or our great grandkids, even in some situations. Like, we're not managing, like, yes, we are managing for the things that we need today, but there is so much of that long time horizon of looking forward into the future and seeing like what can happen. And I mean, there's been in the Southeast, there's been clonal studies where clones were the huge thing. Everybody was planting clones. And then that market just dropped. The clones weren't producing as well as everybody thought. And now, we didn't even get a whole rotation past it in the South, where it's a short rotation, before we were like, this isn't working. And so, then you have to pivot. And so there's a lot of, you have to be flexible, and just kind of think about what we're doing, how it's going to change. And with the like research design, it's so important for people, especially those in academia. And I think they're doing a great job with this, of like thinking about how can we put this information in so we can get more information than we need, so that if things change, we can still continue moving forward with this process. And so that's something that I think is super important. And I feel like in general, people like don't appreciate how much extra thought that has to go into that with academics and just like the research. And then, especially when they have these more short-term like funding to be able to do it. And so it's one of those where, we all as an industry reap the benefits of it. And it's so crucial and so important to be able to get that information so that we can then apply it operationally eventually. But yeah, there's a lot of challenges with just how long of a rotation forests have.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things, it's not just like markets, but it's also like evolving markets. I guess it is markets, but changing markets. Like now we're interested in carbon and deferred harvest and all of this extra stuff that we maybe didn't have 20 years ago. Somebody from 20 years ago might tell me, no, we were still looking at that. But I think it's a lot more prominent now anyway.
Yeah.
And so then just thinking about how, not only do we have the initial problems of, well, our clients are probably primarily interested in timber production, but they also want to add other stuff on top of that. Or they want to do a lease for a solar farm, or they want to, whatever. And then having to incorporate that into the plan makes it, pretty super diverse. Kind of switching gears again, but you talked about, whenever you were studying, when you were in your master's, you didn't really give consulting much of a thought. I kind of had a similar experience. It was like you go to work for industry or you go to, work for academia. But there wasn't much talk about consulting biometrics and, kind of forest analytics and that sort of thing. I'm curious, and then obviously you're very passionate about what you do. It's obvious you get a lot of enjoyment out of being a consulting biometrician. I'm curious if what is your experience of why that might have been? Why do you think that consulting wasn't really in what we understood to be a career path when we were going through school?
So I think some of that is, especially when you're in grad school, a lot of grants are funded either by co-ops. So in a lot of those players, there are some consultants in co-ops. I mean, obviously Larson McGowan and AFM are both in some. But a lot of it is funded. A lot of the like historical people that have been in co-ops for a very long time are the industry folks. And then also, or you're being funded by grants, which are typically Forest Service, sometimes the Departments of Forestry or Department of Natural Resources, depending on the state. So it's a lot of times Forest Service grants, sometimes it's state grants. And so I think some of that is just like, for me, that was just what I was used to. So when I was in grad school, I very much thought I was going to go into academia or honestly the Forest Service, or that's kind of because I was on a Forest Service grant. So that's the people that I was like, had connections with, was academia and Forest Service. And so, so I think it's just something that like students don't get a lot of exposure to. And I have been very fortunate that I've been able to do some guest lectures currently at the University of Maine, UGA, and Virginia Tech. And so being able to do those, like I've been able to kind of talk more with students about just kind of exposing them to consulting. Because it is a little bit of a different world than if you work for industry. You know, you go to meetings, and there was some place I remember hearing you say, like, you gave a presentation, you're like, this is this really cool thing we're doing. And somebody from a company in industry was like, we've been doing this for 20 years. But they don't talk about it because they want to be on cutting edge, and they want to be ahead of everything because that's their secret sauce. And so like some of that stuff just doesn't get released. But in consulting it does. And so it's kind of, I think, kind of related to that, where like people just don't have exposure to it, so they don't know that it's happening. And also I think consulting, especially in like the biometrics world, has become more prevalent. Back when everybody was vertically integrated, every company just had their own biometrics team. Like that's how your people worked for Union Camp, or they worked for Champion, or, you know, well, people still work for Weyerhaeuser, but Weyerhaeuser's always been around. And those types of companies, because that's who they worked for, because they had their own biometrics team. But some of those companies aren't around anymore. Or, you know, some of those companies have been absorbed by other people. But now, like, we do a lot of consulting for people who have historically owned like the land that they own now as a TIMO was historically vertically integrated. So historically, that company's biometricians would have done it, and now they don't. And the TIMOs are trying to keep themselves kind of a little bit more lean. And having a biometrician on staff isn't necessarily always the most beneficial for them, especially if they are trying to stay a little bit more lean. Some of them also, just in the way that their companies are structured, they have to diversify who works for them. So they can only have so many people that they have, and then they have to, you know, can only give so much land to AFM and so much land to Larson and McGowan and other consultants to manage. And like we can't just manage all of it for them. So I think some of that also is what kind of why consulting is bigger. And people just didn't know about it. I mean, even in my time at AFM, I've been here 10 years. We went from right before I started at AFM, there was one biometrician. Now we have 3 biometricians on staff, and we have a contractor who pretty much exclusively contracts with us pretty much full time. So we essentially have 4 biometricians on staff. So, you know, we've expanded a lot. And so I think that's some of it. But yeah, like I like to, when I get a chance, talk to students about, you know, this is what life in consulting or industry could look like, because there is such a pigeonhole. And maybe other people are better at like imagining what their life would be like. I was very much like, this is the data that is presented to me. This is what my life will look like. And so I just never really thought of it. You know, I'd like kind of heard about AFM, but the whole way I got in was Nate Herring, my boss, his advisor was also Phil Radke. And so when they were adding a position at one point in time, he reached out to Phil, and I was with Phil at the time as his student still. And so he forwarded the email to me. And that's how I really got my foot in the door with AFM. And so it's just kind of one of those, like, you know, there is so much of like, who do you know to get into some of these positions? And also just like, who have you been exposed to? Like, if you don't know that this company has biometricians, why would you think to look at them? Especially because some companies have names that sound nothing like forestry. There's no timber or forest or anything like that in their name, but they manage a lot of land. So yeah, so I don't know. I think some of it is like changing atmosphere. I feel like also, you know, you and I both talk a lot when we're at meetings. And so I feel like you and I both make an effort to go out and talk to students and talk to other academics and just like talk to different people in industry. So just doing a better job, you know, advocating essentially for ourselves in the industry also helps. Not saying that people were doing a bad job at it before, but if you're one biometrician doing a lot, you might not make it to a lot of meetings. Or if your company doesn't necessarily see the benefit in sending people to meetings. So yeah, I think some of it's just not having people out there and talking to students. Just kind of makes it hard. For me, it was hard to kind of picture what I was going to do outside of academia or, you know, working for the Forest Service or maybe some of the big companies. I didn't know it existed. And, you know, for me, I was so focused on finishing school. I was very ready to be done. So it's kind of one of those where, you know, I just wanted to get through everything. And yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, I think exposure is a lot of it.
Yeah, I think I would mirror that entire statement. It's just exposure. I think the consultants in the past probably did a very good job of showing up at the co-op meetings,
Mhm.
but not at other meetings. Or if they were indeed at the conferences, they weren't giving presentations, so you didn't really understand what's going on there. Um, but as you said, I think we're getting better with our exposure. I mean, you and I going to conferences and meetings and just talking with the students is very helpful.
Mhm.
I think the other thing that y'all have done and we've also started doing is having a biometrics intern,
Mhm.
because then they get that experience in consulting and get to go back to school and talk to all of their friends about that experience. That's helping with the exposure as well. I also found it rather enjoyable to work with an intern who's just like really excited to learn. And it
Mhm.
just is like a good recharge of the energy, which is probably why professors enjoy mentoring grad students.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was, we had our first, I think we've had two since the time that I've been at AFM. We're having another one this summer, interns, you know, kind of both in biometrics and our resource planning, analyst type Woodstock environment,
Mhm.
which honestly, the Woodstock things that I learned have really helped me as a biometrician. So like, I feel like that's
Mhm.
a good learning opportunity for students as well. But yeah, just being able to get to work with them has been super rewarding. You
Mhm.
know, again, I was in education for a while, realized that's not what I wanted to do. I don't want to go back for my PhD. I don't want to be a professor. But I do get to kind of tap into that skill set that I do have. And
Mhm.
just, you know, get to work with students. And yeah, it is exciting seeing like the things that they're learning and, you know, getting exposed to more than just the universities that have co-ops, because some of the students that have applied for our internship are not people that are part of a co-op, and so you know I
Mhm.
might not necessarily know them very well, but getting, you know, so getting exposed to those programs as well and seeing the things that they're learning and just kind of, you know, being able to mentor them and help them get where they need to be, because I'm also very aware of the fact that I am where I am today because I've had great people mentoring me.
Mhm.
Starting from, you know, as simple as, hey, do you want a job working in my lab learning R? Like, cool, I have no idea what I'm doing, but yes, I would like that. To, you
Yeah.
know, just people taking me under their wing and helping me, you know, helping me navigate through giant intimidating meetings. Because
Mhm.
honestly, as a student, going to meetings can be very intimidating. There's all these people that know each other because we're a very small industry and we tend to all know each other pretty well. Even if
Mhm.
it's, you know, I only talk to you once a year, like I see people regularly once a year, you know, can see how
Mhm.
they're doing, how work's going for them. You know, I tend to remember random facts about people. So, you know, ask them about how their family and all of those things. And so, you know, you just have these connections with these people. And when you're a brand new student and you don't know anybody, like it's a
Yeah.
little intimidating being like, all of these people know each other. I know no one. Who do I talk to? Like, I'm just going to stand in the corner and pretend I'm not here because I feel awkward. At least that's how I felt as a grad
Yeah.
student.
Yeah.
And you know, we have a lot of introverts, so it's one of those where I feel like a very common feeling for us. And so, you know, just going out and making sure that like, you know, we're able to like talk to new people and talk to
Mhm.
people that aren't part of the co-op and get to know them. Or, you know, if I see any of our previous interns at different meetings, like it's a really great, like I automatically have a connection with them and it makes it
Right.
easier. You know, I feel like also for those students, having those connections with professionals is really beneficial because like, oh, well, that student knows someone, so maybe I can go and talk to them. And so it just kind of like
Mhm.
helps it work out. And yeah, and as far as students go, like that is something that I do try and do is make sure I'm talking to different students when I go to these
Mhm.
interactions, because again, I remember how awkward I felt.
Yeah.
And it is so intimidating because you've got all of these big people that just know a lot of people, like they're big names, like some of them are, you know, people that you've cited a bunch
Right.
of times or you're planning on citing a bunch of times in your thesis. Not me, I don't have a lot of publications, but there are people that like at these meetings that have just tons of publications and like they're just this giant in your mind because you know them, but they're a laid back cool person, like. And so
Yeah.
it's just, you know, making sure that those connections can happen. And I feel like our internship program, I've gone all around on this. I feel like the program does really help with that because
Yeah.
you get to start meeting these people that seem like big giants and know everything. And just like, all right, they took time to teach me something. Like, I know something too.
Right. It's interesting how much the SOMENS and NEMO meetings have changed. You know, my first meeting was in 2009, I believe, and I was the only student. And then all of the professionals there, they were, I think, mostly academics. I remember Mike Oppenheimer was there, but you know, it's all like old guys with big mustaches, and they're looking grumpy, and they're just like, and you're like, oh, I'm feeling judged right now. And
Mm-hmm.
as an introvert, that is so really hard to deal with.
Yeah.
But I feel now the meetings, I mean, we're probably getting close to 50-50 of professionals and students,
Mm-hmm.
and they are giving their presentations and they're coming in and they're so well rehearsed. They know their data, they know their presentation, and they give great talks. I think it's really exciting to see that compared to where I started.
Yeah. Yeah. My first meeting was a NEMO meeting. And I think I was also the only student. And it was in York, Maine in November, and it was really cold, and my room didn't have heat that night, like the night before the meeting. So it was a weird event. And yeah, I was just very cold because I hadn't really warmed up yet, and the room was cold. So we talked a lot about it being cold. I do remember that. But yeah, just a lot of people, like it was a lot of academics, and there was a bunch of Forest Service people there. And yeah, just talking about all these things I didn't know. I think that is the first time I met Aaron Weiskettel, who now like I see at meetings all the time, and I super enjoy talking to him. But if you would have told me then that I'd be, comfortable talking with all of these people that were just very intimidating, I don't know that I would have believed you. So for any students listening, it does get better. You do eventually get to meet everybody. And if they look scary, don't worry. They're really approachable. Just talk to them and talk about modeling, and everybody gets excited. We're a
Yeah.
bunch of nerds.
Just a quick story. I think it was the first joint meeting that I went to, and Aaron was there, Aaron Weiskettel, and he might not remember this, and I've never talked to him about it, but I was so intimidated by him because he's obviously so awesome, and he's been
Mm-hmm.
on the podcast before. We had a great conversation, but the first time I met him, we were in like the after hours room. Everybody was talking and having fun. And I don't know if Aaron's a bit introverted. It seems like he could be, but him and I stood in a corner for like half an hour and we didn't say a word to each other. And finally I was like, nice to see you. And I headed out. It was like the most awkward experience. I'm like, well, should I say something? What should I say? And so I know, bringing it back to what you said, I know as a student, those things can be very complicated,
Mm-hmm.
especially if you are introverted like me. It can be very difficult, but you got to get into that mindset. Like, I get to do this once a year, maybe. I've got to get out of my comfort zone a little, and that's how I get to know people. And if you do something silly, nobody's going to remember.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, again, for any students listening, if you ever see me at a conference and you don't know who to talk to, come up to me. I will chat with you about pretty much anything.
Yeah.
We can talk about trees. We can talk about hobbies. We can talk about the weather. Like I'm good.
Yeah,
Just come approach me. We'll have a good conversation.
exactly. Well, the last thing I would like to talk about today is just, given your experience in, forestry modeling, where do you think we're going? Like, what do you think are going to be like the next big steps in, our scientific advancements in forestry? And I will precursor that with whenever I ask the old guys what surprised them most from the last 20, 30 years, some of them 40, 50 years, it was just computing power, right? Because they went from writing programs on cards and submitting it to a mainframe the size of a classroom to, now having basically infinite technology at, their fingertips. Where do you think we're going?
Yeah, that's a good question. We I definitely feel like the computing power is definitely something that's huge. The things that we're doing now, if we had the technology for, say, LiDAR or remote sense data, that's, very intensive, plot data on a whole stand where, you've got a plot every 10th acre. They could have never done anything with that back in that time. So I think kind of as computing power keeps moving up, I think that'll keep kind of expanding for us, the things that we can do. So I mean, I definitely think there's things that I probably have no idea about right now that people are working on that will, move us forward. But yeah, I also think, I feel like obligatory AI conversation. I think, AI is going to keep moving us in places. And that's something that like, I am very interested in like seeing where AI can take us. And I know for me, like I struggle with it because a lot of the things that people are like, oh, just plug this into AI, like I know how to write that line in code in like it's going to take me less time to write that line of code than it is to ask AI to do this. But I think like, so it's kind of reframing my thought process on how I can use AI to kind of help me do things, whether it's, making my code more efficient. There are plenty of things that I know I do in my code that are not the most efficient. But it is more efficient for me to run the inefficient code than it is to take a couple of days or however long it's going to take me, maybe even only a couple of hours to make this more efficient. Because, it'll save me a minute. It's more efficient, but it's not like saving me a lot. But again, as things tend to get bigger and things get more complicated, I think those types of efficiencies are going to definitely be huge. I do think that we're going to continue seeing more remote sensed inventories, whether that's from LiDAR or satellite or drones or things we haven't thought of yet, backpacks, like any of those things. I think we are going to continue seeing more of that. And some of that is like, we were talking about, it is harder to find people that want to go out and inventory. That's just not something a lot of people that are going into forestry school necessarily, like some people going into forestry school, that's 100% what they want to do with their career. But there's less people like that than there used to be. So I think having some of that and just having more remote sensed inventories is going to definitely continue to increase. I think some of our growth routines, I think we're going to start seeing more individual tree things instead of more stand level information. I think kind of being able to do things on individual trees is going to continue to increase. Trying to think. So I feel like we'll have that. I think we'll just keep relying on technology more. I think, I don't know, like there's a lot of really good statistical models out there. Somebody on one of your episodes was saying like, I don't know how many more times we can refit this model and make any improvements. Like, because there have been times where people will do a refit and be like, well, the original is better. So we're going to stick with that. So I don't know that it's necessarily that, but I think the type of modeling that we're doing is going to be different. If we're doing a lot of remote sensed data, we have a lot of height diameter relationships where we, predict the height based on the diameter. And you can use that kind of backwards to get diameters based on heights, but maybe hit that more. Maybe do, if we have this entire whole stem thing, figure out better merchandising so that we can merchandise the stem better and more accurately, especially on that individual tree level. So yeah, I think there are going to be some things that are very much the same. We're still going to need growth curves. We're still going to need merchandising. I don't think those like core things are going to change. I think the way that we handle them are going to change. The way that we manage our data is going to change. At AFM, we've gone from, doing a lot of stand level modeling to we're now doing a lot more stand table projection where we're taking those diameter distributions and we're moving them forward. So, that's a different way to manage data because instead of just holding on to those stand level metrics, we now need to make sure that we're storing all of that tree information and all of the plot information. And so I think things like that are kind of where things are going to change and not necessarily, I think the core of our industry isn't going to change because trees are trees. They're going to keep growing how they grow. It's just kind of how we get to those metrics. I think we're going to, finesse things, find ways that are a little bit easier or just give us better information. It might be processes that we have in 10 years are much more complicated and difficult than what we're doing now, but they just give us so much better information for our foresters. It might be more than 10 years. I don't know. And so I think that's kind of where we're going, where overall it'll look the same, but there's going to be a lot of nuances that are different and just kind of how we're looking at things differently.
Both you and I are very, very kind of advanced skill set in R. We use R for pretty much everything. What do you think about, you know, 20 years ago it was SAS. Before that, it was Fortran. Some people are still using Fortran, but I'd say the majority of younger biometricians are maybe not.
Mhm.
Um, do you think we're going to see like evolvement with different languages? Are we going to become the old guys who are like using SAS, and then the new kids are like, oh, you should have been in, I'll throw Julia out there because Christian loves Julia, but
Yeah,
whatever is the next thing.
probably. I think some of like the pushback on like using SAS is the cost of the license is really expensive. So yeah, I do see us going to more open source things in general. Even in my 10 years of my career, we've gone a lot more open source with things. So yeah, so I do think there will be more open source. Probably different languages will change. I mean, the one thing that R does do really well is the statistical aspect of things. And so, Python does, from what I don't Python code at all. I only do R. But from what I understand, Python does a lot better with like data manipulation and management. And so I think there'll be potentially more of a marriage of that, of like doing your data management and manipulation in Python and then moving it to R, because R isn't the most efficient to do data manipulation. But again, sometimes is it better to use a more efficient tool that's going to take you a really long time to learn, or is it better to just keep kind of plugging along? Also, having things in the same system can be beneficial. So yeah, I think also I think just better system integration is going to probably be a thing. Gone are the days of, well, I have an Excel file that has this inventory and you have it on paper file for a different inventory. Like everything's kind of getting better and it's getting housed in better databases.
Right.
Big data is something that, it's not just something we talk about in biometrics. You hear about it in the news, you hear about it in, I hear about it on TikTok sometimes because that's just my algorithm. But like, you hear about these things with like big data and how you manage it. And so I think, yeah, like those are things I think, yeah, we'll probably see a shift in language because somebody writes something that isn't written now that's a lot more efficient, or utilizes, like, I think C++ is more efficient than R because R is written on C++. I don't know all of these things, but so maybe somebody writes something that is similar to R but utilizes things and makes it more efficient. So I think as like more technology is developed, yes, we will shift things. Someday we'll probably be the old ones that are holding on to the thing that we know how to use. That's okay. Like, talking to people who only use SAS is still super important because we're doing the same things. They're just doing it differently. And sometimes the way that they have to code things, they think about it slightly differently. And so, it leads to innovation on our end, on the younger side still, because, we're thinking about it through how they think about it. And so, yeah, I think we'll probably change. Selfishly, I hope we don't change because I've gotten decent at R.
Right.
But it's one of those, as the times change, we'll figure out and we'll continue going, and we'll keep adapting as forestry does. And hopefully it doesn't have too steep of a learning curve so I can still learn it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, agreed completely. I think one of the things that we're seeing, you mentioned AI earlier. I don't know if you've tried out the new Positron yet.
Haven't.
It's the new like art platform that it integrates AI and these large language models and all of that. It's if you remember, if anybody used SAS and then SAS Jump came out and it was just kind of a point and click and get your results. I helped so many people who were using that who had no idea what they're doing. It's like, okay, why did you do the t-test versus whatever? And they didn't know. And I'm just like worried that with this new like access to AI, which is still super flawed, people are going to just be doing like, wrong analysis. And, again, that just might be the not old guy, but middle-aged guy here saying like, oh, we got to be better at this. Whereas, I mean, and my wife is an academic. She's a professor of chemistry, and she knows who's using AI on their homework and who's not, right? because you get the stupid mistakes that it's like, why would you ever think of that? You go punch the question in AI and it gives you the wrong answer, and you're like, oh, obviously that's where they got it from.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I just wanted to say, like, I'm a little bit concerned. I think we still need very technical people, but
Mhm.
with the way that things are evolving, it's trying to make these more technical skills, I guess, easier accessible so that you don't necessarily need to know as much technical information.
Mhm.
But is that kind of just dumbing us down and letting us use something, that we think is, right and it's not? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. So I've seen this really great example. I don't know who it's from, so I feel bad that I'm not crediting them. But it was this teacher who was doing like a lesson on AI, and she had this picture of a beautiful sunset, and she told all of her students to like, you get to draw it, but you have to draw this beautiful sunset and make it look as close as possible. And you have to draw a slip of paper, and that will have some constraints for you. And some of the constraints were you're not allowed to use any warm colors. You're not allowed to use any cool colors. You can only use black and white. And some people were allowed to use everything. And so like the whole premise of this, for AI specifically, is like AI is a really great tool. It can be like your warm colors. And so it's one of those things, but you can't create a beautiful sunset with just your warm colors. Granted, there's AI pictures not exactly correlated, but like in order to create this beautiful drawing, like you really need all of these different tools, whether it's AI or, your own knowledge, learning how to Google things. That's one of the things I feel like I learned the most during graduate school. My forestry background is another thing. So being able to do all of these things and create this like beautiful picture of how you're doing it, you need to be able to have all these different tools. And while AI is a great tool, yeah, it is hard. Like it is hard to see like, what are you doing that's dumbing it down? And in reality, like the thing that makes it tough, and like, being from a generation that AI, when I first started learning about AI, it was like very deep, intense machine learning, complicated systems with neural networks and nodes and things I still don't understand. And so now that it's just like this, you open up a website and you're like, create this thing for me. It's very different from what it was when I started my education. And so, yeah, being able to like, if you're only using AI to do things, you're really kind of letting yourself down because you're only using the warm colors. And so like being able to communicate to people like, yes, it is a good tool. You should use it. I have plugged things into AI that I was spending a really long time trying to figure out, is this the same file from these two different sources, and they need to be the same file. And I just plugged it into AI, and AI did it in like 5 seconds. Great tool. But it was also one of those where I needed to be able to use my logic to then know what to do with this. And so, yeah, so I do think there's a lot of great things with AI. It is a tool that I think, we need to continue utilizing as an industry, myself included. Like I said, I don't always know how to handle it. And so just kind of trying to reframe my mindset in that, but also just like, remember it's a tool, so that we're not just ending up with pictures of sunsets without any yellows. And so, yeah, but it's hard to be able to tell. And if you're always relying on it, you're really only hurting yourself. But also it's like such a double-edged sword, because it's such an important tool to use because it is so powerful and it can do so much. So yeah, I'm still wrapping my head around AI.
Yeah, same here. But overall, I enjoyed your kind of like outlook on what you think is going to happen in our field. And I guess I tend to agree. It's, the advancements in technology haven't stopped. I think, in fact, they're only growing faster, which is generally expected. It'll be interesting to see where we're at the end of our careers, and what we've accomplished and what we're making the young guys do, because we can't do it anymore. All right, Clara, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your story and your outlook on, forest consulting biometrics. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this. It's been good listening to other people and just kind of their outlook. Some of the people I've had lots of conversations with, but it's still good to see just kind of what their outlook is and where they think we're going, where we've been, and just kind of knowing all of that. It's good. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I think you're a great person for this. Super into asking questions and having conversations with people, and even just knowing who to ask is a skill set that is definitely needed. And I'm glad we have you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I appreciate the kind words. Again, I've always said I don't think I was the right guy for this. Being an introvert, it's very difficult putting yourself out there like this.
Mhm.
But I think it was necessary, and I was tired of waiting around on somebody else to do it. So I'm very happy, though, that I'm getting to share people's stories with the rest of the biometrics community and the world, really.
Yeah.
It's been great.
Yeah. I think you're the perfect guy for it because you're doing it.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye.